Hello world of YouTube, and today is June 4th, 2012. In 2 days, one of my best friends graduates from East Stroudsburg Senior High School, and congratulations, you made this far. Good luck in the future. And for all the seniors of East Stroudsburg South in the senior high school, congratulations and good luck in the future. You deserve the diplomas that you'll be getting after your ceremony. So the first thing I want to talk about, that was the first thing I wanted to do, was congratulate them. But the other thing I wanted to talk about is one of the best decades to ever exist. Not only musically, but in fashion form, respect form, you name it. The 1950s was the golden age of the 20th century. Because in the 1950s, the economy was stable. You had teenagers dressing up like this, with corduroy pants, which are still made today, dress shoes that were flat, except in the 1970s they started getting a bigger side, but basically had the same concept. If it was just if a guy was just taking his girlfriend on a typical date to a mulch shop, that's what it was called back then, mulch shop. You would typically wear a polo and a sports coat, called back then, with the old 50s song, a white sport coat and a pink carnation. Well, when it came to prom dates, they wore suits or tuxedos, depending on what they preferred. But they wore suits or tuxedos with ties, white shirts, and there were multiple colors in the 1950s. Purple was a popular one for some of the guys, but that would be for people who immigrated over to the States. If you ever seen the West Side Story, that took place in the 1960s, but same concept. Purple was a certain type of color for some people. Some people it was a white shirt, some people it was a blue polo with corduroy pants and sports coat. I mean, this was the style of the 1950s. And the music of the 1950s was so romantic. The 1950s music was not only romantic, but it set a generation. The only other decade that would be able to do that is the 1970s. Although the 1960s did set generation with the music, it didn't set fully with the generation. As the generation in the 1950s, they knew what their music meant. They knew what it was. They knew the stories behind it, the feelings, the messages that told. I mean, in the 1960s, you had the Beatles, Monkees, the Beards, Elvis, in the 1960s, who basically told truth in their music. Not as much as the other bands, Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, and all that. That was just music that was loud in the 1960s. The 1960s introduced heavy metal, but there was no special meaning behind it. As if the song Smoke Gets in Your Eyes from the 1950s, 1959, had the message of love is blind, but that can't be denied because that's a fact. Smoke gets in your eyes because you're blinded, and love is like a ring of fire. which was also from the 1950s. It builds smoke and it gets in your eyes so you can't see the true fact about who you're with. You can't see who they are because you're so in love with them. It's blinding. That's that's the whole purpose of that song, and that's why the 1950s is one of the greatest because I have one of the most. That was one song that was romantic, but the other song was "I Only Have Eyes for You," and it stands true today. But I only have eyes for you. Guys, sing that to your girlfriend. Learn the lyrics. Learn the backup vocals and all that. But learn the lyrics. Sing it to your girlfriend. I guarantee you she'll love the song. Because if you have a true relationship, she'll love the song. Because she'll know that you only do stuff for her and that you are only there for her. Sure, you'll help with your friends with their problems, your other friends, but if something happens to her, you're right with her side from the beginning. And that's so important about that song. It expresses what true love was. There's no such thing as true love anymore. There's no such thing as gentlemen anymore. I'm the only true gentleman of my generation because whoever I date, I'm not saying I'm bi, I'm not, I'm straight. I have no problem with gay people, and that's one thing about the 1950s that was so welcoming, was that in the music scene you couldn't come out being gay because you were talked against. Not true. Liberace, for all his years, he wore flashy clothing. So in 1956, Elvis Presley performed Hound Dog and Blue Suede Shoes on Milton Berle show, and he wore a gold suit, complete gold. It's like kind of this beige color with the pants, except it had complete gold flakes on it and all that. And Liberace wore that style, and he showed the world, hey, I'm gay, and I don't care what you say. Behind me, my music ability is so amazing. And he had one of the biggest fan bases in the 1950s that had like cruise style to it. All his music was piano. That was all his music. And Elvis liked it because he learned from it. He could pick up on the style of piano, and that was his inspiration to play piano, was Liberace. Now, sure, were there people that talked against gays in the 1950s? Sure, you had some. But the majority welcomed them. The majority said, hey, I don't mind if you're gay, like, you're still my friend. And that was amazing about the 1950s. Discrimination, though, was a bad part of the 1950s. That was the only part of the 1950s that no one liked. The Crew Cuts sang Shaboom. Was it their song? No, it was a cover version. Who sang it before them, recorded it, but it was a black group. In the 1950s, if you were an African American group, chances are you wouldn't be played by any other DJ in the world except for Dick Clark. Dick Clark was the only person that played your music and said, I don't care what color you are, what race you are, what you look like, what you dress like, or either what religion you are. If you have a unique style that I like, if you have a unique style that so rare that no one else has your style, I will not only play it, but I'll get you the national fame you so desperately want. And that brings me to a artist of the 1950s who did have the black style in it, combined country, gospel, rhythm and blues, and made it into rock and roll. He took all those. At the time, there was country western, there was gospel music, there was rhythm and blues, and those were basically what you heard on the radio before Elvis Presley came along. And when Elvis Presley came along, he took all those three. He took those three genres and combined them and created rock and roll. Even Little Richard, I'm quoting Little Richard at this point, he opened the door for black music. So Elvis Presley sang this music. That's Alright Mama, Arthur Krupp, who sang it before on an old recording. He liked Arthur Krupp because the way his guitar playing skills were, because at the time, that's when Elvis got his guitar, and that's when That's Alright Mama came out. And just by hearing it, that's how poor Elvis was, just by hearing it, he could pick up on the chords, he taught himself how to play guitar. But Arthur Krupp had a type of style that took gospel and rhythm and blues, combining them together to create soul. Now, when soul was created early, no one knew what soul was until the 1960s. Late 1950s, early 1960s. My bad. So, Elvis Presley, in Sun Records in 1954, went down there to record he went down to Sun Records on Beale Street to record a song for his mother's birthday. And he recorded a cover version of Connie Francis' My Happiness. And another song, When Your Heartaches Begin. I forget who sang it, but she was one of the originals of slow rock and roll. It was considered slow before Elvis came in. And so anyway, Sam Phillips was impressed with Elvis's voice. That called him in 1955 and said, I got a list of songs that maybe you could be good at. And he went all through them. He said, sorry, I thought these songs would be good for you, but you can always try again some other time. And Elvis Presley, while taking a 5-minute break, was singing, that's alright, mama, that's alright with you, that's alright, mama, any way you do, but that's alright, maybe that's alright now, mama, any way you do. And he started playing his guitar. Bill Black and Scotty Moore came in. At the time, electric guitar was known as an amplified guitar. They didn't call it electric until the 1960s. And Sam Phillips came out of the back section recording studio. He said, boy, what the hell have you been holding back on me? You know those type of songs? And I was responded to him, sir, I know all types, country, hillbilly, pop. And Sam Phillips says, you're the person I'm looking for. And I was like, sir, I don't understand what you're saying. He's like, I've been looking for a white artist who would sing in the black style. And Elvis was it. He could combine all those styles and create them into rock and roll. And just to give you a brief example of how Elvis' style was, I'll show you. Now, although my head's cut off, Elvis was a little bit taller than I was. He was 5'8", 5'9". He was taller than I was by 3-4 inches. He was taller than I was. But I'll give you a prime example of what he did. He was so nervous on stage that in 1955, he recorded Blue Moon of Kentucky after That's Alright Mama's success in the South and in the North a little. He was an unknown in the North. But in the South, he was well known. In Tennessee, to be exact, Mississippi, Georgia, you name it. But so anyway, in Blue Moon, Kentucky, when he got to the instrumental version, Scotty, it's recorded that Scotty told him that, how about you make it more fun? He bent over and played his bass. Back then it was an acoustic bass, which would, okay, if I had one, I would have a 17-inch. A 17-inch would go down from the sole of my shoe right now, and go from the sole of my shoe right now, and it have a big body, and would go up to here. And Scotty turned it outside and played it like that. And Elvis was so nervous that he shook his legs, and the girls went crazy. And after his performance, I was like, man, what got them wrong? He was like, no, what are they screaming and hollering about? This guy said, because you're shaking your legs. You're moving your legs. And so Elvis took the advantage, good way. So every time, for example, in Heartbreak Hotel, he was like, he moved his leg like that when he was like, da 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 da. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. And he was amazing with dancing while playing, but just by that certain leg movement he did, parents, uh, when he became national in 1956, parents thought he was becoming a little too sexual with the dancing. And at first it was nervousness, and people were okay with that because you do get nervous when you perform for the first time in front of a large crowd of some people you know, but some people that you mostly don't know. And nervousness, they could understand. But when he's intentionally shaking his legs and doing this all the time, parents thought, PTA, Parents Association, whatever, thought he was crazy, thought he was a sex addict. And truth is, he was messing around with girls behind stage, but that's not important. But whenever he would do this and gyrate his legs, or just that itself, parents got concerned. And see the way I am right now. You can see my full body, although my head and neck is cut off, but you get the picture. So since then, he did his thing, but you didn't see it because he was shot from the waist up. That's how it kind of is with me right now. because I'm shooting myself from the waist up to give you an idea how the 1950s were. You couldn't gyrate your legs like Presley did. He was considered a rebel for doing that. He was considered very rare. And in the 1950s, that wasn't acceptable. That was not acceptable at all. Now, you had artists who were shown from the full by, like I saw my head next cut off by Bobby Darin would be shown like that and turn around like that, and that wasn't considered sexual at all. That was just turning around, snapping fingers, swing from side to side, and tapping. But Elvis was a big concern for the young girls at the time. And a little FYI, the Catholic nuns, the Catholic Church, they were so against birth control that if a 16-year-old girl in the 1950s got pregnant, she had to have the child. That would consider 17, 18, even younger than that. It's crazy, but that's how things are still today. Now, in the 1950s, besides music-wise, the cars were great. The cars were fat. The cars were fashionable. Cars, hold on a sec. You may not know what a 1950s car is, the ones that were born in the 1980s and all that. You might not know what a 1950s car is, but I do have a Hawaiian shirt, which does have a resemblance of a 1950s car on it. Hold on. Yeah, here. Now, see that car? That would be a resemblance of a 1950s car. Now, that type of 1950s car was used in movies like American Graffiti, Happy Days, which was a TV show. Trying to think of others. Elvis. How many Elvis movies there were, but they were used in that. Uh, there were several other shows that they used 1950s cars in. A lot of people assume that they're 1960s, that there were Model Ts in the 1950s. That's what some people assumed in the 1970s, that there weren't any classic cars from the 1950s until they really looked at these types of movies. Oh, and Grease. Yeah, Grease. Um, so cars were affordable back then, believe it or not. Um, Part-time in the 1950s was like $7.58. No, $7.38, I believe. Or it could have been lower. I'm not sure. I don't keep up with economics in the 1950s because I don't want to go back and do all that math because I hate math altogether. So, minimum wage. So you work about 5 years, you would have about 20,000, probably 14,000 in your bank. And depending on where you worked, like a malt shop or auto parts and all that, back then cars literally cost $200, maybe 500 for new ones. So it was relatively cheap back then. In the 1960s, they increased it from instead of the 200, they moved to the 500, maybe 1,000, and it got ridiculously expensive throughout the years. And I guarantee you, my generation, which is from, if you're born 93, 94, but my generation now, we know cars cost about 20,000. Some are. Just think, 15 years down the road from now, we're probably going to be in our late 20s, early 30s. Cars, believe it or not, will probably be 30,000, possibly 45,000, just for a new car. So in the 1950s, that's why I say it was the golden era, because cars were so cheap. So were TVs, and it was just amazing. Like, you could afford everything back then. Now you can't. It's impossible to buy a car without putting insurance on it. And in the 1950s, you really didn't need insurance because there were barely car accidents anywhere. And that was the beauty of it. You needed a registration, though. That was required by law. But otherwise, you didn't honestly need insurance because there was barely car accidents. Maybe a car accident happened once every year, but that would be one time. The only time insurance was demanded was in 1959, around December, after the death of Richie Valens, the Big Bopper, and Buddy Holly. They crashed his plane because of the snow and all that, and that told people that make cars, airplanes, trains, automobiles, scooters, bikes, yada yada yada, that you needed insurance to stay safe. And from 1950s, no, they had to go by through the process of insurance law. From 1960 on, you need insurance, which was a very good call in 1959 because 1960 car accidents could happen anywhere, anytime. In the 1950s, you were safe. You could walk across the highway without getting hit. But in the 1960s, Route 66 was a popular song, and people started traveling on it. And people could walk on Route 66 in the 1950s without getting hurt. But in the 1960s, it was so popular, the song, it was so popular, the highway itself, that, yeah, you couldn't walk on the highway anymore. That's still with today. There's some highways you can walk on. They're barely used anymore. Some are barely used, and you could walk on them. But mostly, no, you can't walk on highways anymore. You used to be able to in the 1950s. That was the golden part of it. But not anymore, which sucks. This concludes part one of the 1950s era, and see you some other time for part two.